So the interesting thing about Singapore is that de facto, it was over between 50, 52 at the latest. You see this massive flowering of activity. And the reason for that was because the British, thinking that Singaporeans were interested in politics, held free and fair elections with an expanded electorate, and of course Singaporeans then elected the great David Marshall, right, whose role in Singapore has been very badly neglected. We were very, very lucky to have David Marshall as our first chief minister, because this was a man of incredible personal integrity. He wasn't a very good politician, but he was a great leader because he set a moral example for government, which no one has, which every leader since has had to pay lip service to, but no one has ever managed to meet, right? And he's the only leader to ever resign out of principle because he said, I failed to deliver what I promised, so I have to resign. So because of Marshall, because he refused to do things like order the police to break up legitimate strikes, to oppress the people of Singapore the way the colonial government wanted to, that enabled this explosion of political activity, of independent organization, in which a lot of Singaporeans then learned how to organize, protest. It was an 18-month workshop on organizational democracy, associational democracy. I think that's what de Tocqueville called the strength of America, associational democracy. And out of that really grows all these, a lot of the strength. The PAP itself, of course, was a trade union party, and it was the middle road group of unions, and then this tiny political wing comprised of these English-educated professionals. And it was only because then the British clamped down that then the political side gained prominence. But it's because of that freedom that we had to begin with that allowed a lot of these, a lot of Singaporean future leaders to learn, right? And then of course, because then the British then limited competitive politics to the Legislative Assembly, then, but they kept things pretty much fair within the Assembly. Then the opposition, led by Lee Kuan Yew, then was able to learn a lot about the practice of parliamentary politics, and that stood them in good stead. And because the elections were still themselves, right, were still honest. So what the British did in '59 was prevent certain people from running, but otherwise they didn't interfere. And so Singaporeans overwhelmingly elected the opposition into power. And that's how we got this incredibly competent for, everything else they've done, authoritarianism and all that, which we don't agree with, but they were also incredibly competent and honest, right? And that's because of all these, the circumstances in which they existed, in which Marshall set his example, in which he opened up, in which the British enabled open political competition. All of that then gave us a government which, for everything else it did, was very competent in the late 60s, early 70s. So you can see how, as I've always argued, democracy and dissent and debate has set up a lot of Singapore's success. And of course, a lot of policies that the PAP implemented weren't their own, right? The SIT was swept away by the Labour Front government. HDB was actually created out of legislation passed by the Labour Front government, but then they lost power before they implemented it. It was the PAP which implemented it. The CPF was created by the British colonial government as one of the last acts of the Legislative Council, and they passed it in early '55. Industrialization was, there was this great consensus, especially in the Chinese mercantile press, which said, if Hong Kong and Taiwan are industrializing, why aren't we industrializing? So because of this open contest of ideas, all these things were debated in public, and then the PAP were able to implement them after this massive debate.
Okay. Yeah. So I'm going to deviate from my professional competence and remember a lot of things. I said I was old, but I remember this in the harbor, the Bugis fleets. Every so often the harbor would be full of these tall ships coming in, sort of like regularly. We would all be very excited. So when you said you didn't know what the Bugis was, oh yes, quite interesting. And back to the politics of it. Obviously, you know, like my family was a member of the, I guess, the English educated profession. Were not rich, but were English educated, right? Professions. And I remember visiting a friend and the PAP trying to recruit my father, you know, who wore white pants like they all did in those days, and he said no. And I said no money, and the guy started and said, it's not about money. It's not about money. And it was very interesting because growing up at that time, this little thin elite out of which all of you grew, you know, no, I think we were afraid of the Chinese educated. Okay, and there was, so when PJ was talking, I was thinking about, yes, but it was all, you know, like the Barisan socialists went and painted red Barisan stuff on our retaining wall. My mother kept calling them up and said, can you remove this, and so on. And so we were actually afraid because the Chinese school students, you know, they all had all these, they had all these, what's his name, Charlie Hot Charlie, yeah, I mean, it was really interesting. That comic book, I gave it to my mom, and she just loved it because she remembered all these things that we had forgotten, that had been erased from our collective memory, right? Because they had not been put into the Singapore story. This is not part of the Singapore story. But I do remember riots. I do remember getting very excited every time there was like curfew, then we don't have to go to school. You know, it was all this stuff. And, but Lee Kuan Yew was a left-winger. We were scared of him, right? I mean, he was a left-winger. And I remember when the PAP was like 1959, my mother said, soak the rich, that's all they say. And she would say, whoever comes in after the British will cut civil service salaries, but the PAP will cut them by more, and cut it by 25%. How different times are. But it was really interesting. Definitely Parliament, David Marshall was a lion of a figure. There were all these discussions, there were all these, you know, much later, like 20 years later, I would go to opposition rallies, you know, like for fun, you know, just to see what's going on and so on. But definitely I do have a memory of a much more vibrant, vital, contesting and diverse people. You know, my mom would say, oh, that, whoever's a member of parliament, Chi Jiang Fan lady, you know. Like, even hawkers can be in parliament. That's what the democracy is about, right? Now we don't have to, I think it must be 20 years ago already, they said that Singapore and Korea had the most PhDs in parliament. That's not good, okay? Because they do not reflect the society. What you want in parliament are people who, I mean, it's true almost everywhere, only rich people get elected to parliament, but, or Congress. So I think that definitely when your basic question was politics much more plural? Definitely, and it was much more plural actually for a long time, until I guess, from my recollection, when the Barisan boycotted the election, and that's when it disappeared, and we didn't have all these discussions. But as we were talking earlier today, I also remember the press being a lot more free. I was telling, you know, because I have like 2 articles in the Straits Times today, which identifies my conservatism. But this week, yeah. But because that's like the establishment media. But I was telling him, and he was saying, you know, he's a graduate student and they don't want to publish his stuff and so on. But I wrote my first articles in the Straits Times in 1976, so I was a graduate student. Anybody could write in, and we had arguments. We said all kinds of things, you know, I think it was 19 something, we said the education system reproduces social inequality. In the newspapers, and somebody attacked us back, we of course not just a plant, me and my colleague, and it just went on. So you can just go online. I went online and look, oh look, this is what I said, you know, like 30 years ago. And you don't see that kind of in the mainstream media. The mainstream media was so much livelier 30 years ago than now, and so no wonder nobody, like I said, nobody reads the Straits Times. It's so boring, you know. It's so predictable. But it was very lively in my early professional years. So definitely we had a history of greater pluralism of thought, ideas. The university was extremely lively. You know, all kinds of students running around doing things. So I think it's really, the homogeneity was produced, and I think that's actually very fascinating. Okay, and I hope I don't know how much time we have, but I'm interested in the production of homogeneity of thought and what it means for the economy and business, right? Which I think is where we're paying the price.
So plurality is not killing Singapore.
No.
So the book that you mentioned just now was Sonny Liu's The Art of Charlie Chan Hok Chai. He just did a US tour recently, so that's something that you guys can check out. I guess the next question would be, thinking about the government, right? They're coming in, and they're thinking so much about, as PJ mentioned, people migrating here and there, different kinds of people. One thing that they said that they did a lot was social integration, and they felt that that was a big part of getting the country together and not having racial strife. Because, of course, we all remember there was a racial riot, and that determined everything. Right, yes. So, how does race sort of play into it, and what is the social integration policies that they have done that you have felt was effective or not effective? I mean, there was housing, zoning, and all these things that purport that you can maintain your cultural identity, but at the same time, sort of mingle with the rest. So, you know, housing quotas, for those of you who are not familiar, Singapore has this policy where every public housing has a quota on how many Chinese has to be in this place, how many Malays, how many Indians, and the idea is that you want them to travel in the same elevator so that they can actually see each other, and I think the assumption was that that would actually bring some cohesion. So I'm just wondering, as you think about this very plural, maybe at times chaotic polity, how effective were they in integrating them?
Okay, before he goes off on his diatribe, I want to just do like economic. The main thing that the housing quotas do is economically disadvantage non-Chinese. Okay, in a number of ways, it's very, very clear. If you are Malay or an Indian and you have an HDB, you can only sell it to another Malay or Indian. And guess what? It's 20% less. It's kind of like the Malay reservations land, when the British had this Malay reservations policy in Malaysia, where to protect the Malays and have them the land, they could not sell it to Chinese. So of course they became poor, because if you restrict the number of people that can buy the things. So I think several things have happened with economically, clearly it is discriminatory because you can only sell to your own. Number two, it perpetuates you as a minority. Okay? That is to say, you can, and the reason for it, I suspect, is to prevent, one of the reasons for it is to prevent ethnic voting, clusters, okay? I mean, I know we gerrymander, you know, every election we will look and say, oh, look, my district is here. Oh, you're in the same district. Oh, it's like this, you know. It's like a sort of a joke, right? That everyone says, are you in this district? Yeah, we're in the same district, even though we live like very far away. And but that's not enough. So I think it is to prevent, you know, what they call, ethnic voting blocks, right? But there's several things that I just learned actually on my recent visit that I think, you know, there is an issue in Singapore of we have an underclass. It is disproportionately ethnic minority. It suffers greatly. There's a lot of mental health issues, educational issues, and it was through that means, talking to a lot of like rich ladies who work with these deprived people. And one of my friends said, she said, you know, this policy, the moving from the kampong to the high-rise, had a lot of impacts on the Malay population that we did not anticipate. It was extremely disruptive. People who had grown up in a kampong with an extended family, with cousins, which suddenly could not live together. They could not live together because they were the block would be beyond its, 15% Malays quota. And we didn't realize how that, when they worked through with these youth, in what, Torchlight, all these schools, I know people who volunteer in these schools, they're like discombobulated. You know, it's not just industrialization, it's not just the speed, it's not just from the kampong to the high rise, but you broke up families and you broke up communities which were race-based. And now it is coming back to haunt you because we really don't know from a social services point of view how to deal with those populations. Of course, as an economist, I think the most important thing is that you are, you know, because most Singaporeans, the vast majority of Singaporeans' retirement assets are in their house. In fact, this is the other major problem. Singaporeans are asset rich but cash poor. The only thing they own is their house. Why? Because all their savings were put into buying the house. You know, my retirement portfolio is like my house, and then I have stocks and bonds and cash. No, Singaporeans, everything's in the house. And so their main asset has been devalued by this racial quota system in the housing. How do I know? Because my minority friends say, I bought flat top. I said, how much? I said, you know, 500,000. No. Oh, for us, only 400,000 from the buyer's point of view, right? But you think the person who sold it to him lost 100,000 because he couldn't sell it to a Chinese or somebody else.
Okay. This is an extremely contentious issue, and the first thing I want to point out is that Singapore has never had a racial riot. Never. Singaporeans, we are not some sort of fragile, volatile people who will just, you know, if I see a Malay, I'm going to punch him in the face or something. You know, it's complete nonsense, right? We get along, we've always gotten along. The riots that people commonly cite are first Maria Hertog, but that was a colonial riot. It was because of privileges for the European population, and they were treated, the legal system treated them far better than it treated the non-European, non-English speaking population. And then of course 1964 is the other one that's often cited. And that one was because of two reasons. The first was housing. The riot took place in an area where the whole surrounding population had been forcibly resettled, right, or was about to be forcibly resettled. There was massive anger and unhappiness at the PAP, which UMNO was trying to exploit politically along with the Utusan Melayu by saying, look, you know, our Malay brethren in Singapore are being discriminated against by this Chinese government. And of course, the general political situation in Singapore at the time was such that because of the contest between UMNO in KL and the PAP based out of Singapore, both sides were, you know, exploiting race to their benefit, right? And the UMNO, of course, was trying to undermine the PAP in their home base, and so pointing out to Malays the policies where the PAP had failed to benefit Malays. After 5 years in power, the Malays were still significantly poorer off and worse off. Whereas, of course, the PAP was trying to do the opposite and promote this idea that they transcended race, and that UMNO was the racist one by being a party that represented Malays instead of Malaysians, right? So in this context, and again, the racial riots are the racial riots in '64, right, which I call the political riots, are very mysterious because the Malaysian government didn't want to hold an inquiry. The PAP government insisted. When they finally held an inquiry, it was all the way in March '65. The PAP sent a memo with their perspective, and the findings have been sealed ever since. And the only person I think who's been allowed to see the PAP memo was Albert Lau in his book, which he quotes. So we don't know actually what happened, right? What was testified. It's still a secret to this day. But if you look at the circumstances, it's quite clear. It's the politics of the situation, not the race, and the anger was also, you know, resolved manipulation. Now, the other one point I want to make is that race in Singapore and in Malaysia in general is about politics. It's not about ethnicity. It's about politics. And the PAP, one of the things we think about PAP, we think about this for sort of very, this sort of monolith that has existed and always has been consistent. But if you look at their policies and their rhetoric, it has shifted dramatically throughout time, over time. Before '63, the PAP stood for a Malayan identity for Singapore when they were trying to get merger, and also because they knew Singaporeans, we saw ourselves as Malayan, right? Singaporeans first, but Malayans overall. That was our identity, and it was a very core part of our identity because we all had relatives north of the Causeway. And then, of course, once we got merger, then suddenly it became about Malaysian Malaysia versus a Malay and Chinese Malaysia. And then after independence, because the Malay government in KL was now the enemy, then things changed, and then the PAP tried to de-emphasize this idea, but they also had this rhetoric of, oh, we're the Israel of Southeast Asia, which is a hugely offensive and highly inaccurate idea of Singapore. And then, of course, after that, from the 80s onwards, right, you have all these different policies, and of course, as Linda correctly points out, the housing policy, a lot of housing policy was primarily as social welfare, but also utilized to break up traditional social, cultural, political organization. Break up the Chinese working and rural classes. Break up the Malay voting blocks, which, actually, don't forget, they voted PAP in '63, right? And that's what gave the PAP so much confidence to then break their agreement at Tunku and go north and contest the '64 general elections in KL, right? So the PAP wanted to really break up all these voting blocks. So again, it's about race. And then the GRC system, was designed first to raise barriers against the opposition. And then I think Trevor One points out it was only after people said, wait a moment, that is unfair, then the PAP said, oh wait, no, it's about race. You must have a racial minority. But who gets to decide who's a racial minority? You have to go get a certificate from a council that says, that says you are Indian, you are Malay, right? I mean, who gets to decide these things? So there's, it becomes this whole set of criteria and who controls that?
Can we
right?
open it out
yeah.
to?
Yes,
I just want to mention two things from what he said. The whole elected presidency discussion also has, in a way, Singapore elevates race rather than downplays it. We're forced to think about it. And then we have the same old CMIO issue, which, as people said, that again sort of validates race. But I'd like to hear what people have to say.
Okay, great. So we're gonna open it up. The mic is there, and so if anyone has questions, please go to the mic. Yes, please. Thank you. And introduce yourself, your name, and then end it with a question. Thank you.
Okay, I'm just gonna go. Thank you very much, Professor Lim, Dr. Tan. I first encountered your work in Donald Low and Sudhir's book on choices. There we go. And I really enjoyed both of your essays, and that opened me up to like a world of interesting Singaporean voices who aren't espousing a party line.
Yeah.
And my name's Rohan. I'm a sophomore at the college, and I'm interested in development. I had two questions, if that's okay. My first question was about something that you mentioned, Professor Lim, about how Singapore seeks to a sound strategy would be reorienting itself towards the region and acknowledging that it is a part of the Indonesian and Malayan archipelago in terms of economic policy.
Yeah.
How do you think that would play out, or do you think there's any imaginative possibility for that? There's an article from National Geographic 10 years after separation where you still had Singaporean diplomats saying like, oh yeah, merger will happen at some point. And that's not how Singaporeans envision Malaysia or Indonesia anymore. They define themselves against those places. And when you combine this with the fact that today Chinese people learn Chinese, Malay people learn Malay, and Indian people learn any Indian language they want. How do you we're no longer a generation of people who all speak Bahasa.
Yeah.
So how do you see that working?
Yeah.
My second question is the unavoidable one. 2016 has been a sort of time when the Western world seems to really be dealing with the implications of what democracy means and what the neoliberal version of democracy has resulted in, with people voting in very controversial ways for Brexit and then for the election of Donald Trump. We've seen Singapore use things that happen overseas as various justifications for various things, right? The 2011 general election became a social studies chapter in secondary schools about the consequences of democracy. What do you think these moments mean for Singapore and the Singaporean narrative?
Okay, so orienting towards the region is clearly obvious, right? I mean, Singapore grew to be the, before the independence. Okay, Singapore grew to be, the richest country in Asia or whatever, by being the absolute sense, politically, geographically, economically, and so on. But when we got into this sort of export manufacturing thing, we hitched our wagon to the West. Even though we also had Japanese multinationals, it was very much part of Western multinationals' global supply chain, and that's gone. Okay, I mean so I think that that's been going sort of like progressively, and then as early as all these things are very obvious from an economist point of view. It is as early as 1991 maybe that Singapore, it's the government itself promoted, probably before so we were born, this going the external wing and the growth triangles, and we're going to set up all these industrial zones for Singapore companies to move to in Indonesia, Malaysia, Riots, Vietnam, all these kinds of things. So there have been periodic efforts, and then they stop. A lot of Singapore policy is reactive. Okay, it's whatever happens in the world, and then we sort of react and so on. And it's not organic, so you don't have people that develop businesses of their own. It always has to be some kind of government-led activity. So on the very first conference, I believe we were the first conference on the 50th anniversary, January 2015, IPS in Singapore, and it's now published in a book. And they came up with the theme, for me, it was Beyond the Global City, right? And that was where I talked about, I can give you the reference for how focusing on Southeast Asia. The trouble is our minds are not there. Okay, so when I told Carmen this about 8 years ago, he says, no, we are doing this, we are having all these schools, trips, and then I talked to the PERMSEC for Ministry of Education and said, the problem is Singaporeans, okay? They don't want to go to the neighborhood. And she said that I visited some exchange students in Sweden. I said, why did you choose to come to Sweden? I said, because I wanted to go to the US, but I didn't get in. So I went to Sweden. They won't even think of going to, some of the independent schools do, to Cambodia and Laos. So we took ourselves out of the game. Okay? We took ourselves out of the game where we don't speak Bahasa and so on. I actually, because I was actually a Malaysian for 2 years, okay? I had a Malaysian passport, and we learned Bahasa, we had a Malaysia, all kinds of stuff. I actually did my PhD research in Malaysia and Singapore back in the 70s on the multinational, and I studied Malay, and I went there and I stayed with all my Malaysian friends who I met in the US, who were all studying in the US and so on. And it was very exciting for anyone that's interested in development. I've worked on Southeast Asia, and PJ has ever since. And so I get a sense of Southeast Asians' views of Singapore, and we removed ourselves from that. We made ourselves into the enemy, the whole little red dot thing, right? And in the early days, less bad now, but I used to have to pretend I was not a Singaporean, pretend to be a Malaysian, or apologize, that people really felt Singapore was very arrogant, exploitative, etc. And that was mainly because we do have big GLCs that are sort of in the region, but it's like, how can you prepare yourself? I'm at the University of Michigan. We've had a Center for Southeast Asian Studies since 1960. We've taught Indonesian for 60 over years. We've taught, Thai for 50 over years, and so on. We've taught Vietnamese. In that whole period of time that I have been there, I've only known 2 Singaporeans. We have 1,000 over alumni in Singapore who actually bothered to study one of the languages when they were there. Both of them, because they had Thai girlfriends, so they studied Thai. No, I'm serious. I would go for the Singapore Students Association every year and say, you should study Southeast Asian language, you can get credit. We teach Southeast Asian languages at Michigan. They don't even teach at NUS. I was Filipino at the time, Tagalog. We have the biggest Southeast Asian, the oldest, we've been in Southeast Asia since the 1870s, okay? Not interested at all. Then about 10 years later, I meet one of them, and he says, the thing that your advice that I ever since have regretted is that I didn't study Indonesian. Why? Because nobody goes to Singapore for Singapore. They go to Singapore for Indonesia or Malaysia or Thailand, but mostly for Indonesia. And he said, I now have to study this John Wolf thing all by myself because I'm a Chinese Singaporean. I show up in Jakarta working for, I think it was Deutsche Bank or somebody like that. And people think I'm a Chinese Indonesian and start speaking Bahasa to me. He has no competitive advantage against anybody. And he's not the only one. Several of them. He's the guy who set up Dual in Singapore, the Distinguished Universities Alumni League or whatever. Tony Tan was his name. but not Tony Tan, but so I think that because we've been oriented so much towards the West and towards university rankings and the best things, we don't actually go out and try. We don't actually take advantage of what's in our own backyard. So I run an MBA, MA in Southeast Asian Studies program. I've sent many white Americans who took the trouble to learn the languages out there. Many of them doing very well. One of them was president of General Motors Indonesia, and the General Motors decided to pull out. They've all done extremely well financially, making $1 million. And any one of the Singaporeans could have done that, but they were not interested. They were not interested. So I think that is a serious issue. I have lots of thoughts on the second one, but I think better.
I guess just to address the first question, I think first of all, this idea that we don't go to our neighborhood is very much an elite perspective, right? If you're rich or scholarshipable or whatever, you can go to Sweden, you can go to US, but for the working class or the middle class, where do they go? They go across the border. They go the single most trafficked airline route in the world, Singapore-Jakarta, right?
That's right.
And this is, geography matters. Institutions change, governments change, politics change, but Singapore will always be Pulau Ujong, an island at the mouth of the Johor River, and we cannot deny that. And trying to deny that is cutting us off from our incredibly rich legacy, our history, our past, but also from the opportunities inherent in our position. Right? If you think about, if you want to think about economically, if that's the priority, half of Indonesia's population is under the age of 21. It is in a position where it's going to have a massive economic boom just from demography. Now imagine if Singaporeans could speak Bahasa, they could go in there. Singaporeans are hired all over the world because of our country's reputation. If they could go into Indonesia, we'd have so much more opportunity. Instead, Indonesia is going to develop its own capitalist, out of its own population, to develop its own capitalist class and expertise, and Singapore, we're going to be surpassed. So I think the economic opportunity alone, but I think losing the idea of our Malayanness has really cut us off from something very, very important and from a sense of our own heritage, right? The Temenggung of Singapore, his descendant is today the Sultan of Johor. And there are very strong ancestral links. My great-grandfather was born in emigrated Kuala Kangsar. My grandfather was born there. And we have familiar links, we all have familiar links up and down the country. And to deny that because of politics, I think is very short-sighted and foolish. And again, it comes back down to politics because as I mentioned, in the 50s and into the 60s, we very much emphasized our Malayan identity. We had a National Language Institute, and the Chinese left in particular were very strong on learning Malay, right? When the famous sit-ins at Chinese High, the students would teach each other Malay. They would, get people in to learn Malay because they said that is the future. This country is a Malay-speaking country, and we are going to be proud citizens of it. Why should we learn a European language, a colonial language? We should learn the language of the country that we're going to be in. So everyone should learn Malay in addition to whatever language they want to speak at home. So there, we've lost all that. Institutions matter, and they shape us very much. And because of our alignment with the West, we've cut ourselves off from people who should be our brothers and sisters. You want to do the second question?
Maybe we should get, because I don't know how much time we have. We should get.
Thank you, Roman.
Can I just add one more thing then? I think that there's a failure of vision at the highest level in terms of what does it mean to be Singaporean? When you ask someone at the high level, at the government, that they spout buzzwords. There is no clear idea of what it means to be Singaporean, and that is a real failure of the government's vision. And I think they don't really know where they're going. They're just trying to keep the current engine ticking over, and they don't want to be the one who screws up, right? But that's, of course, the first generation of our leadership were not like that. They had this strong vision, for better or worse, and they took us there, and we're better for it today, and we don't have that today, right? So there's this, it's come down to buzzwords, CMIO, multi-ethnic, racialism, whatever.
Yeah, I'm going to tell one story, okay, which may be slightly more hopeful. I guess I've been going to Myanmar, Burma for about 30 years, and I have lots of friends there and so on. About 10 years ago, before the current opening, I decided to interview some Singapore businesses because, like my massage therapist, my hairdresser in Singapore, all have businesses there, right? There were 350 Singaporean SMEs, people without, and the entrepreneurs were people that were, to some extent, being pushed out of Singapore by high rentals. They all didn't have university degrees. Many of them did not finish high school. But they were in Burma at a time when nobody else would go in there. It was very difficult, and they were setting up small things like little spa, hairdressing shop, printing shop, and things like that. Our Singaporeans are very Singaporeans of a certain class. Well, they are, unless it's been educated out of them, and they would rather work in the bureaucracy or government for a nice, comfortable salary. So I think that if we took away our sort of prejudice, when we think about entrepreneurs, we can think some kind of, like Steve Jobs or something. But entrepreneurs are these Singaporeans who have gone out all over, and I have to tell one more story, please. Which is, about 20 years ago, I was in Tonga, one of these South Pacific islands. And I'm a very kiasu Singaporean. My family, my husband and my daughter hate traveling with me because I always have to be the first in line. Okay? So we went very early to the airport, and there was a guy in front of me. The flight was 7, it was 5, there was a man in front of me. And he had a red passport. And he was a Singaporean. So I said, what are you doing? I'm a tourist there. And he said there were about 10 of them, so 20 years ago, and they Singaporeans, and they sold instant noodles in these small places. The whole of the South Pacific only has like 2 million people. And he says he knew them all, right? All the other Singaporeans that were doing this thing. They would go anywhere and do anything. They were so entrepreneurial, and I said, how come we are not like that anymore, right? How come we're not like, and then 10, 15 years ago, when some Minister of State started talking about technopreneurs at University of Michigan, like 200 Singaporean students. So we had the first ever video conference between a Minister of State and the US. They were all there, and he was trying to get them to be technopreneur. Some of these students, most of them were engineering students, said, but it is not our culture. 20 years or 15 years ago, right, whenever technopreneurs came up to Rio 2000, I said, what is your culture? Because one of the things that I study is overseas Chinese business in Southeast Asia. So what do you mean? What is your culture, Your culture, why are you even there? It's because you have a culture of entrepreneurial ancestors who came out and did whatever they did, didn't have some fancy degree or whatever. Now they've given you a fancy degree and your culture is totally different. And 15 years later, we are still talking about, well, they stopped the technopreneur, now they just talk entrepreneur, right? But the technopreneur lasted like, what, 3 years? Yeah. So anyway, sorry.
Second question.
Yeah, lady, she's been listening a while.
Yeah.
Thank you, speakers. Thank you, Professor Lee.
Yeah, that microphone stopped working.
Okay. Thank you, professors, and thank you for the sharing. So, I can hold this. I have two questions regarding the future of Singapore. One is from internal. So the first one is about I read some news and about Singapore's last election and during the recent development in politics, and actually share some similar experience with Professor Lim. I also spent 2 years in Malaysia, but I was not doing any degree, just doing consultant there. So it seems to me that the younger generation in Singapore, some of them are challenging the current regime, the authority of the Lee family and PAP. So, but in the last election, it did not seem to reflect well this part because it just happened right after the passing away of Lee Kuan Yew. So maybe people regard that we owe him a lot. So they didn't reflect on this ballot. But what do you think the future of Singapore regarding, whether PAP will maintain this regime and their governance? And the second one is about Singapore has been doing well since the independence in balancing between the great powers, especially nowadays between China and the United States. But so far, in recent months, we see some diplomatic problem between Singapore and China. So, do you think, especially in Xi Jinping era and in future with President Trump, do you think Singapore needs to reposition itself between great powers? And what about the coordinator role of Singapore in ASEAN country? Do you think Singapore still is a good leader, or coordinator of ASEAN? Thank you.
Were you here right at the beginning?
Sorry?
Were you here right at the beginning when I spoke?
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, well, I mean, my short answer is elections are not free and fair in Singapore, so you can't expect the result to be an accurate reflection of popular will, right? The system is gerrymandered, there's all these barriers, and if you vote opposition, you get punished by lack of, by your town council getting starved. So, yeah, the future, as long as these levers remain in the hands of the PAP, we will continue to see them win elections quite easily because of their overwhelming dominance of the system. Regarding international relations, historically Singapore has maintained, as you say, a balancing between the great powers, and has done so quite successfully. And I think we'll continue to do that in the future. Singapore has allied itself very closely with the US. And we have the significant US military presence in Singapore, and I don't think that is going to change. A lot will depend on external circumstances, of course, but I think Singapore understands that we are very, very tiny and very, very much dependent on, or very much, as you said, international events have a great impact on Singapore. So yeah, I think that's a short answer. Yes.
Can I just give a quick response to?
Yeah, sure.
So some of the people, especially international scholars, they give credit to the art balance between great powers to the wisdom and the sophistication of Lee Kuan Yew, but it is a post-Lee Kuan Yew era. So do you think the current generation of leadership in Singapore has the same level of sophistication as Lee Kuan Yew once did?
I'm very amazed at this overweighting of Lee Kuan Yew. He left as Prime Minister 1991. We have been in a post-Lee Kuan Yew era, or we should have been, for 25 years before he died. Now, the fact that people ask a question like this, shows something. And that is that the PAP succession has been unsuccessful. Because if it was been successful, then he would no longer be this sort of icon. And I know because people kept saying to me, oh, what will happen if Lee Kuan Yew dies and so on and so on. I mean, like, what? You know, so the fact that people outside put so much store by one man, okay, maybe PJ will disagree with me on that, shows two things. How much, one, either that we have been so much made in his image that we are dependent, if he's gone, we're gone, right? I mean, it's stupid, but that's it. Or that the PAP succession has failed to create a Singapore that regenerates itself without the founding father, okay? And I don't want to say anything about the younger leaders. I do know some of them, but and I don't like this line of questioning because it's a very sort of this is a typical sort of international relations. Sorry. International relations pundit kind of thing. You know what? That it is the person that matters, not the systems or the structures. And I just don't think it's a very valid line of questioning.
Thank you, because I major in international politics.
You're well trained.
Hi, I'm Sean. So my questions are, I guess, for both the speakers. Just now you mentioned that perhaps the path that Singapore should take is to reorient itself towards the region. Is that going to be at the expense of countries in the region? So how do you manage the balance between being a player in the region without taking away from the region's capacity to then develop its own class of development? And I guess a related question to that is the biggest myth then that Singapore will remain as a country, like a developed country? Because if the countries in the region were to develop to the pace where Singapore is at now, and eventually take over Singapore, you know, isn't it then the natural state for Singapore to not be developed, and that our present state of development is an exceptional one?
Another problematic question, because this question has a whole embeds a whole bunch of values in there, which suggest that, which are anathema to an economist, okay, which suggests that the economy somehow is like zero sum. That if I do better, you do worse. This is exactly a Trumpian notion that we have to all fight against. We do well. US does well when China does well. US does well when Mexico does well. The data is all there. Singapore does well when its neighbors do well, right? We are so small, they are so big. There's like 600 million people in ASEAN. If we cannot find a niche for 4 or 5 million people, then we have failed. This whole development story is failure. What is development? Development must be sustainable, right? When through development you build up, I'm of course talking like a B-school person, when development, you develop capabilities that are ongoing. When the CEO retires, it goes on. In fact, before CEOs retire, in fact, Lee Kuan Yew said American CEOs retire at 65, I also want to retire at 65, but then he stayed on the board for another 25 years. So, okay, which is also not a good idea. Even if you're the best, you have to give way so that other people can go up. So yes, so what happens when Indonesia does well, when Malaysia does well? We do well because we do a part of their business comes through us, because they will come to our country to buy stuff, sell stuff, services, and we will go there. So it's perfect. Right now, that's our only hope. With US, Europe, China, all not doing well, our only hope is that Southeast Asia and India, because of the demographic dividend, are going to grow. They're going to grow like 5%. That is the only reason anybody would care about Singapore now, because it's part of a 600 million marketplace that still that is going to grow for the next 20, 25 years. If we can't find a role for ourselves, then we're failed. We just totally failed. So I think then the other thing is, from economic business point of view, is if somebody else does better, so we just have to be different. We have to be, as I said, the top of the ladder. We have to make another rung. Okay, they're behind us. We have to make, and we have to create around, that's our own. You have to innovate. You have to innovate. And the bigger the market you have, like your neighbors, the more returns you will get from innovation. One of the problems in Singapore, seen as a nation with respect to, say, tech innovation, is we have no scale. You know, the tech world now is winner takes all, you have to be bigger. There's no way, I don't know how many, there's no way that we can ever succeed unless we can do two things. One, have a larger market, which has to be our neighbors, and two, differentiate. We can't just go to our neighbors and do what like Alibaba does. We have to differentiate. And how do we differentiate? We differentiate because we're not Chinese, we're not Japanese, we're not Korean, we're not American, we're Southeast Asian. And I know we've lost a lot of those links, but I think they can be recreated. And I personally, just my own personal thing, is we can also study and go there as I've done like my whole life. It's tremendously enriched my life personally, intellectually, as well as professionally.
No, I agree fully with what Linda said.
Yeah.
I'm very glad to hear you say it. We didn't prearrange this at all, but
I never met him before.
Yeah. Does that go on to the next question?
Sorry, do you have a response to like the first part of my question, which is, are we able to do that without being at the expense of our neighbors? Are we able to be oriented?
No, I just said that. It's not a zero sum. If we do well, our neighbors do well. If our neighbors do well, we do well. And I don't get the zero sum mentality. Right? That's not what I don't get. I just don't understand the question. Why you would even ask the question?
A rising tide lifts all boats. You know, it's. I think.
Yeah, I mean that's why I said that was Trumpian.
No, because it was prompted by what PJ had said earlier about how there was, I think if I'm not wrong, correct me if I'm wrong, that you had noticed that there was like a class of local entrepreneurs in one of the countries in the region.
Yeah.
So I think it was prompted by then, why don't we let that take its course?
Oh, that would happen. Yeah, it's just that we have a piece of it, that's all.
Yes,
Yeah.
that's what I meant, yeah. We work together with them to develop. So we're in there with them, we develop Southeast Asia together. Together we'd be far stronger, you know. And the alternative is that we get shut out totally, then we lose. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry if I was unclear.
Next question, please.
How come only people
So
on this side asking
No,
questions?
there's only one mic.
Oh, no observational skills.
Problem location. So, can everybody hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm Ewan, and I actually have a question regarding racism because I can very hesitantly accept that perhaps Singapore, everybody got along and there's no racism in the past. I can also accept that the riots were not racial in nature. But I guess my question as somebody very interested in the social sector is a forward-looking one. Given that there is racism in Singapore now, and I say this from personal experience, my family is racist, my friends can be racist, and that there can be people who are perfectly progressive on certain things and completely unprogressive on other things. Given that we also have racism being pointed out on a great scale, given that all of these things are coming out of the woodwork as they are, and they are very much large and fractious issues in society right now, what then do we make of policies that, as you said, the HDB allotment, which perhaps in the past led to great economic detriment, and definitely if they are earning $100,000 less, that's an economic shortchanging. But if we removed it now and we allow people to be able to buy whatever they want, then clearly the districts are in higher demand because the proximity to economic opportunity will start becoming racially divided. And therefore, that would lead to an increase in the racism that we already see when MediaCorp can participate in blackface and can openly say that Indians and Africans are the same. So my question is that if these HDB policies are economic detriments as they are, and even if in the past they were economically motivated, given now that the removal of them might lead to a rise in racism, how then do we grapple both with the weight of history, that there are these policies that were possibly designed for very different purposes and advocated, but now perhaps act in the way that they were supposed to advocate for? And how do we move forward if history is the art of looking into the past to guide us in the future? How do we move to that? Is it simply just a change in the mindset in the government that we need to be more transparent, that we need to focus really on advocating for the right thing? So is it merely an ideology shift? Is it a process shift that we need to bring people together? Or is it a policy shift? There's a certain set of policies for countries in our position that we can move forward from. Because just one last comment before wrapping up the question, nearly every country that I know of that has a racial enclave is ultimately extremely racist. And I know that if there was a racial enclave, my community, of which I do not wish to associate with, but I am associated with, would definitely use it to push for these racist policies. So I guess that's my question. How do we move forward?
Okay, I think this is a very tough thing. I once spoke to the then Sec Ministry of National Development, and he pointed out that we cannot give up the HDB quotas because we will end up like in the private market where there's no racial control. We have ended up, as you all know, with racial, particularly New Indians, right, in the East Coast, right, and there's a whole sort of real estate property kind of thing. So he said, if we look at what's happened with our new citizens and with the private market, people definitely cluster with their own kind. So I don't think that they're going to do that. I can think of ways in which you can compensate. I think there are ways you could be less rigid with the HDB quotas, right? I think that if people want to live in extended families, and they used to allow this, because I do remember they used to have Malay families could knock the door, between them, so they have extended family, which is actually very good for female labor force participation also. So I think that there are ways you could be less rigid in terms of by the block or by the whatever. I think you could also work out subsidies for people so they don't lose out because they're restrained from some. Basically, you're saying, you paid some restraint from market things. So I think, I don't know what PJ would say, but I would say that what I was going to say before you made your last point was that people living in racial enclaves doesn't necessarily mean racism. Okay, we know that forcing people to live together has not alleviated racism. Okay, it is still there. So the question is, which one is better or worse? I'm not a political scientist, so.
Okay, well, thanks for your question. Yes, it is very difficult, but I think first of all, I want to point out that saying that Singapore is not this place where people of different races are going to start fights with each other. It's not saying there wasn't racism. There was terrible racism, especially from the British colonial authorities, right? It was systemic, and it discriminated very much against the people of Singapore, especially, as I mentioned, the non-European, non-English speaking people. So there was definitely racism. The second thing is, I think that you're assuming very much race as this essentialist, unchanging category, right? That these quotas somehow reflect the reality on the ground. But there's a lot of people who are victims of these quotas who also don't consider themselves or don't want to be part of these groups that they're forced into. And I think that is the most important thing about Singapore is that we are forced into a CMIO model, which increasingly and very, very, something like, was it 30, 40, 50% of marriages are either cross-races or cross-national. Yeah. People don't want to be put in these boxes, right? And people don't necessarily fit in the boxes they put themselves in. I don't consider myself Chinese, but I am put in a Chinese box. Why? So I find that incredibly frustrating, and even more so who are of half very, very much mixed and we have very different legacies. So I think the number one thing that needs to be done is to get rid of this extremely outdated model. Don't forget, the HDB policy was not about racial harmony, it was about breaking up racial voting blocks. And the flip side of it, right, is that these people, the Malay communities which used to have MPs who would represent them very strongly in Parliament, don't have that anymore. Instead, now we have tokenism through the GRC system. There were more parliamentarians of minority races before GRCs. It averaged around 30%, 35%. Now it's 20-25%, right? So it has actually decreased, right? All these prescriptive policies has decreased minority representation. So I think the important thing, I would say, get rid of CMIO, let people self-identify, and let people self-organize around what they consider important. If that's identity, sure. If it's class, sure. If it's issues, sure. And that's how I think you can build a much more vibrant, diverse, and tolerant Singapore, right? By letting people identify and make up their own minds about who they want to be. And through that, you can then build a very much more inclusive Singaporean identity. And then, of course, we always need to guard against racism. There is, very strong racism in Singapore, and we also need to have policies which, it's because the other point is that we have these policies which claim to address racism, but then there are all sorts of things that are racist in Singapore which the government does nothing about. All these ads which say Chinese speakers only. And then, of course, an Indian or Malay person will show up saying, I speak Chinese, and they'll say, oh, no, you're not the kind of person we want. We actually want a Chinese. They want flats which are not rented to Indian or Malay people. The government does nothing about this. Instead it says we have the CMIO, and that is solving the racial problem. And it's not, right? So,
okay. So next question, please. Sorry, we're running out of time.
Yeah, running.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I guess we have time for 2 more questions. So thank you.
Hi.
But we have dinner afterwards.
Yeah, we have dinner
So
afterwards.
we can check that.
Yeah. My name is Faraz. I'm a student from Yale and US College. I'm on exchange here at Harvard for a semester. And I just wanted to thank you and to thank this organization and this forum for the tremendous political awakening moment I had sitting over there, listening after being told in social studies lessons that my country was a fishing village that Lee Kuan Yew raised from the dirt to the sky. To hear this entire opposite narrative. And I think as a moment of political awakening, and I think the biggest thing about coming to the United States and studying here, where I know tomorrow there's going to be a protest at Harvard Yard about the appointment of some climate denier to Trump's EPA transition team, and this tradition of student activism is so strong that I think back to my college and my university experience in Singapore, and I think about how the student governments that I was a part of or that I see, their most pressing agenda item is how do we budget a USS excursion next semester? Not how do we try and build something, how do we try and capitalize on the youth that we have? And so I think my biggest question now is, as someone who is now profoundly both shaken and slightly optimistic but terrified at the same time, where do we go from here? What do we do when SG50 came around and the only video I saw shared every single day on Facebook was that speech by Lee Kuan Yew where he talks about whoever builds this nation must have that iron in him. And how he shut down the iron strike. I mean, I came here to a course on global social movements precisely because I wanted to know what is a social movement. The only social movements that I've seen are LGBT during Pink Dot assembling and Speaker's Corner. Even the migrant workers movement in Singapore has some of the most egregious rights violations of migrant workers. They dare not even organize or they dare not even protest in a public location. The LGBT movement is the only movement that I've seen in Singapore right now that has the daring to do that. And so my question to you is, do you see a possibility for a political awakening? Yes, we don't have free and fair elections, but how might we get there? Do you see in the youth of today who have internalized this SS textbook narrative, any hope for the future? Please say yes.
Wow.
Yes. I have huge faith in Singaporeans, right? We are incredibly cosmopolitan and well educated, and I have always had lots of faith in Singaporeans. But institutions matter and institutions shape our behavior. why are your fellow university students the way they are? Well, because of a whole system of monitoring that was introduced by the government. Suitability certificates in the 80s, right? The kicking out of anyone who showed, and of course, then no education means your future is destroyed. The massive government control, right? If the last time, I did this in Singapore, the police showed up and in response to a complaint, right, and made sure they were seen. And of course, I can't work at NUS because I was told, your work has, what Kishore said, the Prime Minister is very concerned about your work. And of course, then later I said, can't work in Singapore anymore. So, you have agency. If you want change, you have to fight for it. And if you would like to work with other people who are working for greater freedom of the media, greater democracy, free elections in Singapore, I can introduce you to plenty of people who are doing that. But of course, the fact is there is going to be a great cost, right? I can't work in Singapore. I have friends who have been driven out of Singapore, who their homes are raided, Solang, Roynam, their homes are raided, and to this date the investigation has not concluded. But almost certainly what's going to happen is that they're going to be found innocent and given a warning, after having their homes turned upside down, their computers confiscated, their property confiscated, then they'll be given a warning and they're probably given back, and then the government will say, oh, see, the system works, right? Never mind the cost of having, 8, 12 months of all your possessions having been seized by the police and things like that. So I believe that the current system is not sustainable, right? I believe that things have to change. As they say, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. And I have long argued that Singapore has succeeded because of the vibrancy of its population, and that 100 years, 200 years from now, we are going to look back at the Lee Kuan Yew era as an aberration from the broader arc of Singapore history. When Raffles founded Singapore, he said, economic liberty cannot come without personal liberty, right? And that has been what has driven Singapore forward. We are this great, incredible, chaotic place which throws up incredible people and talented people and great ideas. And so, maybe we've had 50 years of an exception to that, but we have so much of a future to build, and I really believe in our people. So fight for the Singapore you believe in.
Okay, if I can say something here, I am actually very, very worried for the future of Singapore from an economic point of view. And that is basically in terms of the development strategy, we have reached the end. And we have been trying to redo. Currently the economy is very bad, and I read, and what does everyone say? Oh, we're waiting for Committee for Future Economies report in January. That is our only hope. Wait for some committee that to tell. It was really scary.
It's not even the first committee, right?
No.
Several of those committees already.
We've had every 8 years we have a recession. We will have CSC, ERC, ESC. I studied all of them, right? And they sound, the words are different, but the idea is the same. So I don't know. The fact that these are people in the private sector saying, I'm waiting. Everything went down this quarter. Oh, we just hope. But who are these people on the scene? Why would you expect somebody? Why don't you go and make a change yourself? So that's why. And what I think that is related to is exactly to what you said. Is that Singaporeans, those of you who read my chapter in the hard choices book, because I've actually been consulted by HR people, and so my chapter is called "What's Wrong with Singaporeans," right? And I reflect on, and I was in a big survey recently where everybody else would say, if you ask about multinational managers, I asked my students who are managers, what is the problem? Singaporeans are just not very competitive in a global management context because they're incredibly conformist. Or as I think, I may not have said that in that book, but I said it some. I said that maybe it was a lecture I gave at SMU where I ranted on this. And it was one of my former students said, we expats have job security in Singapore. I said, why? He's white American. Because all Singaporeans think alike. And in business, we need diversity. Okay, particularly at the technological cutting edge. We don't know what's out there. The only way we can know is by having people who think differently. Right? Diversity is not just like a, it's a huge business thing. The corporations in America are just putting huge pressure on us, the business schools, to turn out a more diverse, because that's what they need for their business, right? And so and then they also people went on to say that Singaporeans are boring and whatever. And this goes back to homogeneity, right? And the fact of this created homogeneity is very fine for mass manufacturing era, when essentially you need civil servants who are compradors or rentiers for foreigners that come here and make money, and you're managing the whole thing for them. But when they don't come anymore, or they're going to Indonesia, and by the way, they pay I was told by a banker, so they pay 5 times as much for equivalently qualified MBA in Jakarta as they do in New York in the financial sector, okay? So there's like financial incentive. So I think that comes from not having freedom of thought and freedom of speech. That's absolutely it. I have young Singaporean undergraduates at Michigan who come to me. Yeah, they're young, they're 19 years old, right? And they said their parents told them. Their parents, they've never experienced that, not to cause any trouble, not to say anything. And and so I see like generation after generation, each generation is more and more passive. More and more wanting somebody to do something for them, give me a job, instead of creating my own job. So I think that we're now paying the price for decades of suppression of freedom of speech. I'm not less, freedom of expression. I think it's not just that we don't have the best policies that we could have if we had more discussion, but we don't have different thinking people who can go out and create jobs for Singaporeans in Singapore or in the region, I don't care what. Because waiting for manna from heaven is really irritating. And then just to go back to what he said, there is a cost, right? For me, it turned out very well, and I've never said this in public before, I told you this morning, right? That why am I in America? I'm in America because, I did my degree, I got a job in a university in Malaysia, and so on, and then back in 1977, all my friends, when I was back in Ann Arbor writing my thesis, all my friends were arrested and thrown into jail. Mainly because of one of them called Koh Kwan Ping, who happens to be the chairman of the board of Singapore Management University, right? So I had to go at the last minute to my professors, and they got me a job in Swarthmore College, where they said to me, why are you in the job market at this unusual time? Is it because of recent political developments in Singapore? Because Kwon Ping's arrest was on the front page of New York Times because he was a journalist. He's the CEO of Banyan Tree. And so I stayed away for 4 years, and I tried to go back, right? And my husband is American, but he knows more about Southeast Asia than I do, so went back and had to leave because of gender discrimination. I couldn't get, because he was a male foreigner, he couldn't get, permanent residence. I thought that my male colleague, whose American wife became a PR immediately. I thought the same thing would happen to my husband. No, cannot. Cannot get housing, right? When our daughter was born, forced to put the race. So I said, in Singapore, I said Chinese. They said, no, Caucasian. So when she's like very lazy in school, she said, Mommy, you forget I'm Caucasian. So it's really bizarre, but it was the best thing that happened to me. Because I got something very precious that even my colleagues in Singapore, I got freedom of speech. And I really hope that that doesn't change in America. Because going back to the question of how seriously things are changing or might change, and the concerns people have with civil liberties, and particularly the media, which is being accused of all kinds of things, right? So, but I happen to benefit from freedom of expression, or as one economist told me about 10 years ago when I started studying Singapore again, is they said, you have to speak out because you're the only one whose income stream is not here. Think about that. If I was a foreigner, I couldn't do it because I could be not allowed back into the country. But I'm a Singaporean, they have to let me in. Okay? But you know, the people's income, that's when they choke it off. And I can tell you many, many stories, because I'm much older than him. I've got a lot more stories about what happened to people. But then we all pay the price for it in the current state of, we don't know what we're going to do for our rent next month.
So on that note, you can join us. That's one thing you can do. And so we are running out of time. Dinner is served outside, and I welcome you guys to talk to him. But before that, we have tokens of appreciation to our speakers who have flown all the way here. So Brandon, please.
So thank you to both PJ and Linda for giving us a very interesting talk. It's just a bit small, but guys don't seem to be able to open the box. But basically, inside is just a coaster that says Veritas, which is Harvard's motto, and it means truth in Latin. So in light of all of us finding new opinions, finding new truths, things that we can explore to have a more interesting knowledge and debate in future, thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.
I need to say something about Brandon. Okay? Brandon's father was my student.
Actually,
and he studied, I gave him a scholarship to study Indonesian. And he got a job, and I also referred him for a job with an American multinational, so he went out to Indonesia, went out to Singapore, met his mom. And became a Singaporean. Okay.
So the reason why I'm born is because of Linda.
And because his father studied Bahasa.
So dinner's outside, please help yourselves.
And this is the book Hard Choices with chapters from both PJ and Linda, as well as some very other interesting things. Also, if you did not register, we'd really appreciate it. And please like our Facebook page. If you like our Facebook page, you'll hear more about interesting events, so please do. Singapore and Southeast Asian Forum. Thanks, everyone.